The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt of a roadside diner tucked away on the edge of town. It wasn't much, just a weathered building with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign that read, "Eats and Drinks." But it was enough to catch Sarah Dawson's attention. She had been driving for hours, her two loyal German shepherds, Max and Luna, resting quietly in the back seat of her truck. The open road had a way of wearing a person down, no matter how tough they were, and Sarah was no exception. Sarah stepped out of her vehicle, stretching her legs after the long drive. Her dark hair was tied back neatly, and her worn leather jacket hinted at years spent outdoors. But what really turned heads wasn't her appearance. It was the two dogs trotting obediently beside her. Max, all muscle and focus, walked slightly ahead, while Luna stayed close to Sarah's side, her intelligent eyes scanning the area. Together, the trio moved with an unspoken bond, born from years of working together in high-stakes situations. These weren't ordinary dogs. They were military-trained canines, capable of handling anything from search and rescue missions to apprehending suspects, and everyone who saw them knew it. Inside the diner, the air smelled of greasy fries and stale coffee. A few truckers sat hunched over their meals, while a group of bikers dominated one corner of the room. Their boots thudded heavily against the floor, and their laughter echoed loudly as they swapped stories about their latest rides and escapades. They were a rough-looking bunch, clad in leather vests adorned with patches and insignias. Tattoos snaked up their arms, and their faces carried the kind of hardened expressions that came from living life on the edge. When Sarah walked in, the chatter didn't stop, but the tone shifted. Eyes followed her every move as she slid into a booth near the window. Max and Luna settled at her feet, their presence commanding yet calm. At first, the bikers seemed more amused than anything else. One of them, a burly man with a scruffy beard and a patch that read Razor, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Look at this," he said loud enough for the entire diner to hear. "The little lady playing soldier with her mutts." His friends chuckled, egging him on. Another biker chimed in. "Bet those dogs couldn't scare a squirrel." The comments rolled off Sarah like water off a duck's back. She'd heard it all before, people underestimating her because of her size or gender, doubting her abilities because she didn't fit the stereotype of a tough handler. But Sarah didn't need to prove herself to anyone. Not today. Not here. Still, Razor wasn't done. He stood up, swaggering over to her table with a cocky grin plastered across his face. "So, sweetheart," he drawled, planting his hands on the table and leaning in. "What exactly are these big bad dogs gonna do if I snap my fingers?" His buddies roared with laughter, clearly enjoying the show. Some of the other diners exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of it. Sarah looked up from her menu, meeting Razor's gaze without flinching. There was a quiet strength in her expression, the kind that made people pause despite themselves. "They'll do whatever I tell them to," she replied simply, her voice steady and calm. Razor raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced. "Oh yeah, prove it." And just like that, the challenge was issued, not just to Sarah, but to Max and Luna too. The tension in the room thickened, though Sarah remained unfazed. She knew her dogs better than anyone, and she trusted them completely. If Razor wanted a demonstration, he was going to get one, but not because she felt the need to defend herself. No, this was about showing respect, for her work, for her team, and for the bond they shared. Little did Razor know, he was about to learn a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. The parking lot fell eerily quiet as Razor stepped forward, his earlier bravado now tinged with a flicker of uncertainty. He cracked his knuckles and rolled his shoulders, trying to project confidence, but Sarah noticed the subtle shift in his demeanor. For all his tough talk, he was starting to realize that this wasn't just another game. The air felt heavier, charged with anticipation, as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Sarah stood a few feet away, her posture relaxed yet commanding. Max and Luna sat at her side, their muscles taut beneath their sleek coats, ready to spring into action at her command. She glanced at Razor briefly before addressing the crowd. "This is a simulated apprehension scenario," she explained, her voice clear and steady. "It's designed to test the dog's ability to respond to aggression or perceived threats. Once we begin, Razor will act as the threat, and the dogs will react accordingly." Razor smirked, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "No problem," he said, flexing his arms again for effect. "Bring it on." Sarah nodded and turned her attention back to Max and Luna. She gave them a series of soft commands, reinforcing their roles and ensuring they were prepared. Then, without hesitation, she signaled for Razor to make his move. At first, Razor played it cool, walking toward the dogs with exaggerated nonchalance. But when Sarah gave the cue, a sharp whistle followed by a single word, he suddenly lunged forward, raising his fists and shouting loudly to mimic an aggressive stance. It was meant to startle, to provoke, but Max and Luna didn't flinch. Instead, they sprang into action with breathtaking speed. Max surged ahead, moving like a blur of muscle and determination. Before Razor could even process what was happening, Max had closed the distance between them, planting his front paws firmly on Razor's chest and pinning him to the ground. The impact wasn't brutal. Sarah had trained her dogs to control their force, but it was enough to leave Razor stunned, his breath knocked out in a whoosh. Luna stayed close behind, circling protectively with her teeth bared, her deep growl sending shivers down the spines of anyone watching. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Razor lay flat on his back, staring up at Max's intense gaze, unable to move. His friends, who had been cheering moments ago, now stood frozen in shock, their mouths agape. No one dared to intervene, not after Sarah's warning, and the only sounds were Razor's labored breathing and the faint rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. Sarah stepped forward calmly, her voice cutting through the silence. "That's enough," she said, giving a gentle command to Max. Instantly, the dog released his hold and stepped back, retreating to Sarah's side with perfect obedience. Luna followed suit, her posture relaxing as she returned to her handler. Together, the two dogs resumed their positions, looking as composed and unruffled as if nothing had happened. Razor scrambled to his feet, brushing dirt off his jacket, his face flushed with embarrassment. For a man used to being the toughest guy in the room, this was a humbling experience. He avoided meeting Sarah's eyes as he muttered, Okay, I get it." But Sarah wasn't done. She turned to the bikers, her expression serious but not unkind. "These dogs aren't here to hurt anyone," she said, gesturing to Max and Luna. "They're trained to neutralize threats quickly and efficiently. Their job is to protect, not to attack unnecessarily. What you saw here was a controlled demonstration, but in real-life situations, things can escalate much faster. That's why respect matters, for both the handler and the animal." Her words hung in the air, sinking in slowly. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, some nodding quietly while others shuffled their feet. Even Razor, still catching his breath, looked genuinely chastened. The mocking energy that had filled the parking lot earlier had vanished, replaced by a newfound sense of awe, and maybe even gratitude. As Sarah called Max and Luna back to her side, she couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. This wasn't about proving herself or rubbing their noses in defeat. It was about showing them the truth, that strength comes in many forms, and sometimes the most powerful lessons come from those we least expect. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah's training sessions with Razor and his gang became a regular occurrence. What had started as an impromptu lesson in discipline evolved into something far deeper, a shared journey of growth and transformation. The bikers, once known for their rowdy behavior and confrontational attitudes, began to change in ways no one could have predicted. Even the townsfolk noticed the shift. The once dreaded sight of leather-clad men rolling into town now carried a sense of calm that hadn't existed before. Each session was different, tailored to challenge the group both physically and mentally. Sarah incorporated elements of K-9 training into their exercises, emphasizing teamwork, communication, and trust. For example, she taught them how to read body language, not just in dogs, but in people too, so they could anticipate situations before they escalated. Max and Luna remained at the center of it all, serving as living examples of focus, loyalty, and control. The dogs didn't judge or hold grudges. They responded only to intent and action, a lesson the bikers absorbed quickly. Razor, in particular, embraced the process wholeheartedly. He went from being the loudest voice in the room to someone who listened intently, often asking questions about how to apply what he learned in everyday life. "It's not just about handling ourselves better," he admitted during one session. "It's about showing the world we're not just a bunch of thugs. We can be more than that." Sarah nodded approvingly. "Change starts with choice," she told him. "And every day, you're making choices that prove you want something better, for yourselves and for others." The bond between Sarah and the bikers grew stronger over time, built on mutual respect and shared goals. They weren't just students anymore. They were allies, people Sarah genuinely enjoyed spending time with. During breaks, they'd sit together under the shade of trees, sharing stories about their lives. Razor spoke openly about his troubled past, how he'd grown up in foster care, bouncing from home to home, never feeling like he belonged. Others shared similar tales of hardship, revealing layers of vulnerability beneath their tough exteriors. In return, Sarah opened up about her own journey, the sacrifices she'd made to become a K-9 handler, the challenges of working in a male-dominated field, and the profound connection she felt with Max and Luna. Her honesty resonated deeply with the group, inspiring them to push harder and aim higher. They began referring to her as Coach, a title she accepted with quiet pride. One evening, after a particularly intense training session, Razor pulled Sarah aside. His expression was unusually serious. "We've been talking," he began, glancing back at his friends. "And we want to do something bigger, something meaningful." Sarah tilted her head, curious. "Like what?" Razor hesitated, then explained. "There are kids around here, kids like us when we were younger, who don't have anyone looking out for them. No role models, no guidance. We thought maybe we could start mentoring them, teaching them some of the stuff you've taught us, show them they don't have to follow the same paths we did." Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. She hadn't expected this, a group of bikers wanting to give back to their community. But it made perfect sense. They understood struggle better than most, and now they had tools to help others navigate it. "That's a great idea," she said, her voice filled with encouragement. "But remember, mentoring isn't just about teaching skills. It's about showing up, being consistent, and caring enough to make a difference." The bikers took her advice to heart. Within weeks, they organized a small program aimed at helping at-risk youth in the area. Razor and his friends visited schools, community centers, and even juvenile detention facilities, sharing their stories and offering guidance. Max and Luna became unofficial mascots of the initiative, drawing smiles and curiosity wherever they went. Kids who had once feared the bikers now looked up to them as protectors and mentors. For Sarah, watching this evolution was nothing short of remarkable. These men, whom society had written off as troublemakers, were proving everyone wrong, including themselves. And in doing so, they reminded her of why she loved her work. It wasn't just about training dogs or handling threats. It was about building bridges, breaking stereotypes, and creating opportunities for growth. Together, they were rewriting their stories, one paw print, and one step at a time. The next morning, Sarah was back on the road, her mind replaying the events of the previous day. She hadn't expected the encounter with Razor and his gang to leave such a lasting impression, not just on them, but on her as well. As she drove through winding country roads, Max sprawled lazily in the passenger seat, while Luna kept watch from the back, occasionally resting her chin on Sarah's shoulder. The bond between handler and dogs had always been unshakable, but now it felt even stronger, reinforced by the respect they'd earned against all odds. A few days later, Sarah decided to stop at the same diner again. It wasn't part of her original plan. She didn't need to pass through this town, but something about the place lingered in her thoughts. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the faint hope that the bikers had taken her lesson to heart. Either way, when she pulled into the parking lot, she wasn't entirely surprised to see a familiar row of motorcycles lined up outside. Inside, the scene was different from her last visit. The diner buzzed with energy, but instead of jeers and taunts, there were nods of recognition and quiet greetings. Razor spotted her first, waving her over to a booth where he sat with a few of his crew. Gone was the cocky smirk. In its place was a look of genuine warmth. "Hey, Sarah," he said, standing up briefly as she approached. "Didn't think we'd see you again so soon." Sarah smiled faintly, sliding into the booth with Max and Luna settling at her feet. "Just passing through," she replied casually, though her eyes scanned the room. The other patrons seemed more relaxed around her this time, some even offering polite smiles. Clearly, word had spread about what happened in the parking lot, and not just the demonstration itself, but how Sarah had handled the situation with grace and professionalism. Razor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Listen, I've been thinking about what you said, about your dogs being trained for protection and discipline." He paused, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. "Made me realize we could use some of that ourselves." Sarah raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "Well," Razor continued, glancing at his friends for support, "we're not exactly known for being disciplined people. Most of us grew up rough, you know. No one ever taught us how to handle ourselves without fists or threats." He gestured vaguely toward the group. "But after seeing how you work with Max and Luna, I started wondering if maybe we could learn something too." It was an unexpected request, one that caught Sarah off guard. She studied Razor's face, searching for any trace of mockery or insincerity, but found none. For the first time, she saw vulnerability beneath his tough exterior. These weren't just reckless troublemakers. They were people looking for direction, however clumsily. After a moment's consideration, Sarah nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "If you're serious about learning, I'll help. But it won't be easy. Training takes patience, focus, and consistency. And it's not just about physical skills. It's about mindset." To her surprise, Razor grinned widely, clearly thrilled by her response. "We're ready," he said, pounding a fist lightly on the table. "Whatever it takes." Over the next several weeks, Sarah began working with the bikers in makeshift sessions held in open fields and empty lots. At first, the lessons focused on basic self-discipline, how to control their movements, maintain awareness of their surroundings, and communicate effectively under pressure. Max and Luna played key roles, demonstrating techniques like controlled approaches, perimeter checks, and de-escalation tactics. The bikers, initially skeptical, quickly realized that these exercises weren't about turning them into soldiers. They were about teaching them how to carry themselves with purpose and restraint. As the training progressed, Sarah noticed subtle changes in the group. Razor, once quick to anger, became more measured in his actions. Others who had relied on brute strength started using strategy and teamwork instead. They still joked and laughed among themselves, but there was a newfound sense of camaraderie built on mutual growth rather than intimidation. One evening, after a particularly grueling session, Razor approached Sarah as she packed up her gear. "Thanks," he said simply, his voice thick with gratitude. "You've given us more than just skills. You've shown us a better way to live." Sarah looked at him, then at the rest of the group, and felt a swell of pride, not just in herself, but in them. In helping them find strength beyond bravado, she had also discovered something within herself, the power to inspire change, one person and one dog at a time. The diner grew quieter as the tension between Sarah and Razor simmered. Patrons who had been minding their own business now found themselves glancing over, unable to ignore the brewing confrontation. The bikers, emboldened by Razor's bravado, began chiming in with snide remarks. One of them joked about how Sarah probably carried treats in her pocket to keep her pets happy. Another suggested that maybe Max and Luna were only good for fetching sticks. Their laughter filled the small space, but it didn't rattle Sarah. Instead, she kept her focus on Razor, reading him like she would any potential threat, calmly, carefully, and without panic. Razor leaned closer, his voice dripping with mockery. "Come on, sweetheart," he said, tapping the table with his knuckles. "Show us what these dogs can do, or are you all talk?" His tone was teasing, but there was a sharp edge to it, as if he was daring her to back down. Around him, his friends egged him on, clearly enjoying the spectacle they were creating. For them, this wasn't just about testing Sarah. It was entertainment, a chance to assert dominance in a place where they felt untouchable. Sarah took a slow sip of her coffee, buying herself a moment to think. She knew situations like this could escalate quickly, especially when egos were involved. But she also knew her dogs. They weren't just tools or weapons. They were partners, extensions of herself. Every command she gave was rooted in trust, discipline, and years of training. Still, something about Razor's arrogance grated on her. It wasn't so much the insults directed at her. It was the dismissive way he spoke about Max and Luna, as though they were nothing more than oversized house pets. "I don't perform tricks for crowds," Sarah finally replied, setting her mug down gently. Her voice was calm but firm, carrying an authority that made even Razor pause for a split second. "My dogs aren't here to entertain you." Her words seemed to have the opposite effect. Rather than backing off, Razor smirked wider, clearly interpreting her response as hesitation. "Oh, come on," he shot back, spreading his arms dramatically. "You brought him in here, didn't you? What's the harm in showing us what they're made of?" He turned to his friends, gesturing toward Sarah and the dogs. "What do you guys think? Should we see what these mutts can really do?" The bikers erupted into cheers and catcalls, their voices blending into a chaotic chorus of encouragement. Some pounded their fists on the table, while others whistled loudly. The noise reverberated through the diner, making it hard to hear anything else. Even the staff behind the counter exchanged uneasy looks, unsure whether to step in or let things play out. A few customers slipped out quietly, not wanting to stick around if things got worse. Sarah glanced at Max and Luna, who remained perfectly still beside her. Their ears twitched slightly at the commotion, but otherwise, they showed no reaction. To anyone else, they might have looked relaxed, almost lazy, but Sarah knew better. Beneath their calm exterior lay coiled energy, ready to spring into action at her slightest command. She felt a surge of pride watching them, knowing that despite the chaos around them, they trusted her completely. But Razor wasn't done pushing. He crossed his arms and leaned against the table, his grin widening. "Tell you what," he said, lowering his voice slightly, though it still carried across the room. "If your dogs can impress me, I'll buy you dinner. But if they flop," he trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. "Well, let's just say you'll owe me an apology." The challenge hung heavy in the room, punctuated by the murmurs of the crowd. Sarah weighed her options. On one hand, walking away would be the easiest choice. She didn't need to prove anything to these men. On the other hand, ignoring their taunts wouldn't change their perception. Worse, it might reinforce the idea that women like her didn't belong in fields dominated by toughness and grit. And then there was the matter of respect. Not for herself, but for Max and Luna. They deserved better than to be dismissed as mere accessories. Finally, Sarah sighed and stood up, brushing crumbs off her jeans. "Fine," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a knife. "But not here. Outside." Without waiting for a response, she grabbed her jacket and motioned for Max and Luna to follow. As she headed toward the door, the bikers scrambled to their feet, eager to see what would happen next. Razor led the charge, his earlier swagger replaced by genuine curiosity. Whatever doubts he'd harbored moments ago were fading, replaced by a flicker of anticipation. If Sarah was willing to step outside, maybe there was more to her, and her dogs, than he'd assumed. As the group spilled into the parking lot, the cool evening air did little to dampen the excitement. Razor stood there for a moment, brushing off his jacket and trying to regain some semblance of composure. His face was flushed, not just from the physical impact, but also from the blow to his pride. The man who had strutted into the parking lot with cocky confidence now looked like someone who had been caught off guard in the most unexpected way. He glanced at Max and Luna, who were sitting calmly by Sarah's side, as if nothing unusual had happened. Their calm demeanor only made the whole situation more surreal. Sarah didn't gloat or rub it in. Instead, she watched Razor carefully, her expression neutral. She knew that moments like this could go one of two ways. Either he'd double down on his arrogance, refusing to admit what had just happened, or he'd take the lesson to heart. For a tense few seconds, no one spoke. The bikers shifted awkwardly, unsure how their leader would react. Some looked ready to step in if things turned ugly, while others seemed relieved it hadn't gone further. Finally, Razor cleared his throat and straightened up, running a hand through his scruffy beard. "All right," he said, his voice quieter than before. "You proved your point." He held up his hands in a gesture of surrender, though there was still a hint of defensiveness in his tone. "I underestimated you. And them." He nodded toward Max and Luna, his earlier mockery replaced by something closer to respect. "Guess I owe you an apology." Sarah raised an eyebrow slightly, surprised but not entirely convinced. "Apologies aren't necessary," she replied evenly. "But understanding is. My dogs aren't here to intimidate people. They're trained to protect and respond when needed. That means they can tell the difference between a real threat and someone posturing for attention." Her words hit home. Razor's shoulders slumped a little, and he let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, guess I learned it the hard way." He glanced at his friends, who were watching him with a mix of amusement and disbelief. Then he turned back to Sarah, his grin fading into something more genuine. "Seriously, though, thanks for not letting them, rip me apart or whatever." The tension in the air began to ease as laughter rippled through the group. One of the bikers called out, "Man, Razor, you got taken down by a couple of pups." The comment drew chuckles, even from Razor himself, though he shot the guy a half-hearted glare. It was clear that the mood had shifted, from hostility to camaraderie, however begrudgingly earned. Sarah crossed her arms and gave Razor a small smile. "Like I said, it's all about control and trust." She gestured to Max and Luna, who remained perfectly still beside her. "They wouldn't have done anything without my command. But once they're given the signal, they don't hesitate." Razor nodded slowly, clearly processing what she meant. He crouched down cautiously, extending a hand toward Max. "So, mind if I try again? Properly this time." There was a vulnerability in his voice that hadn't been there before, a willingness to learn rather than dominate. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "Go ahead," she said, signaling to Max to stay calm. Razor moved slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. When his hand finally rested gently on Max's head, the dog didn't flinch or growl. Instead, he leaned slightly into the touch, his tail wagging faintly. "Huh," Razor muttered, standing back up with a sheepish grin. "Never thought I'd say this, but these guys are pretty impressive." He looked at Sarah, his earlier bravado completely gone. "And so are you." The other bikers started to relax too, some stepping forward to get a closer look at Max and Luna. Questions poured out. How long had Sarah trained them? What kind of tasks could they handle? Could they really sniff out danger like they did in movies? Sarah answered patiently, explaining their training regimen and sharing stories from her time in the military. As she spoke, the initial animosity melted away, replaced by curiosity and admiration. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the parking lot in shadow, The atmosphere had transformed entirely. What had started as a confrontation had turned into a shared moment of learning and mutual respect. Even Razor, who had begun the evening mocking Sarah, now treated her with deference. Before leaving, he extended his hand to shake hers, a gesture that might have seemed small but carried significant weight coming from someone like him. As Sarah walked back to her truck with Max and Lena trailing behind her, she couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet triumph. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about breaking down barriers and showing people that strength comes in many forms. Sometimes, the toughest lessons come wrapped in the softest barks. The parking lot was bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun, its rays stretching across the cracked asphalt and casting long shadows from the row of motorcycles parked haphazardly near the diner. Sarah stood calmly at the edge of the lot, Max and Luna sitting attentively by her side. The bikers gathered around in a loose semicircle, their leather vests glinting faintly in the fading light. Razor pushed his way to the front, arms crossed, his smirk still firmly in place. Behind him, his friends exchanged grins and nudges, clearly expecting some kind of spectacle, or at least an easy laugh. Sarah turned to face them, her expression steady and composed. She didn't need to raise her voice or make grand gestures. Her presence alone commanded attention. "All right," she said, addressing the group but looking directly at Razor. "If you want to see what my dogs can do, I'll show you. But let's get one thing straight. This isn't a game. These aren't circus animals performing tricks for applause. They're highly trained professionals, and they respond to commands with precision." Her words seemed to catch Razor off guard, though he quickly masked it with another cocky grin. "Sure, sure," he replied, waving a hand dismissively. "Let's see it then. Show us how professional they are." Sarah nodded once and stepped back, giving herself room to work. She knelt briefly beside Max and Luna, speaking softly to them, in tones too low for the onlookers to hear. Her voice carried calm reassurance, reminding them of their roles and reinforcing the bond they shared. To anyone watching, it might have looked like she was simply petting them, but there was purpose in every movement. A subtle cue here, a reassuring touch there. When she stood again, both dogs were alert, their bodies poised and ready. "First," Sarah announced, raising her voice slightly so everyone could hear, "we'll start with basic obedience." She walked a few paces away from the dogs before turning back to face them. With crisp, clear commands, she began putting Max and Luna through their paces. "Sit." Instantly, both dogs dropped into perfect seated positions, their postures upright and focused. "Down." Without hesitation, they lowered themselves smoothly to the ground, their eyes never leaving hers. "Stay." The crowd murmured appreciatively as Sarah took several steps backward, creating distance between herself and the dogs. Even when she turned her back momentarily, neither Max nor Luna moved a muscle. Their discipline was undeniable, and even Razor's smirk faltered slightly. Okay, he muttered, trying to sound unimpressed. "So they can sit and stay. Big deal." Sarah ignored him, continuing the demonstration. She added more complex commands, weaving in hand signals that showcased the depth of her training with the dogs. At her signal, Max trotted forward in a straight line, stopping precisely where she pointed. Luna followed suit, circling around behind him and returning to her original position flawlessly. The synchronization between handler and dogs was mesmerizing, each movement flowing seamlessly into the next. The bikers, who had started out jeering, now watched in silence, their skepticism slowly giving way to curiosity, and maybe even a hint of admiration. But Razor wasn't ready to concede just yet. As the obedience portion wrapped up, he stepped forward, shaking his head. Yeah, they can follow orders," he said loudly, drawing the attention of his friends. "But can they handle something real? Like, say, taking down a threat?" He flexed his arms dramatically, as if daring Sarah to put her dogs to the test against him. Sarah hesitated, her brow furrowing slightly. She hadn't planned to go this far. Simulated apprehensions weren't meant for casual demonstrations, especially not in front of a crowd. Still, She understood why Razor was pushing. In his world, strength and dominance were everything, and he wouldn't be satisfied until he saw proof that Max and Luna could back up their polished routines with raw power. "Fine," Sarah said after a moment, her tone firm. "But listen carefully. Once we start, no one interferes. If either of these dogs engages, it's because they've been given a direct command. Do you understand?" Razor nodded eagerly, already rolling up his sleeves. "Got it," he said, puffing out his chest. "Let's go." Sarah turned to Max and Luna, kneeling once more to prepare them. She spoke quietly, ensuring they understood what was expected. While the situation was controlled, there was always an element of unpredictability when dealing with high-energy scenarios. Trust was key, not just between her and the dogs, but also within the environment itself. As she stood and signaled for Razor to step forward, the tension in the air was palpable. The bikers leaned in closer, anticipation buzzing among them like static electricity. This was it, the moment of truth. Whatever happened next would leave a lasting impression, not just